Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Cullen International webinar on quality of service and quality of experience. My name is Laurence Niveau. I'm a senior analyst with Cullen, and I specifically focus on our publications dedicated to consumer protection issues.
I'm Elena Scaramuzzi. I've been with Cullen for the past 10 years and been following mainly the Americas, and now I'm into new research regarding global trends, so with global scope.
Before we start, just a quick word on who we are, because some of you may not be familiar with what we do. We monitor and analyze regulatory development in 4 key sectors, in telecoms, in media, digital economy, and postal sectors, and we also look at competition law as applied to all these sectors. Our footprint is in all the Americas, in Europe, in Middle East and North Africa, and more to come, as Elena said, on a more global scale.
Soon we will cover Asia and Africa, so stay tuned.
Stay tuned for that. I have some more words of introduction before we dive into the topic. Just to explain you the platform you landed on today, you have different widgets which you can make bigger or smaller. You have the media player where you see us. You have our slides, which we will be presenting. And you have a resource list with the slides that you can actually download, but other documents as well. You have a Q&A box, so you can ask us questions, and we will try to answer them at the end of the presentation. For the question we will not be able to answer, we will come back to you by email.
As soon as possible.
As soon as possible, of course. And finally, you also have a survey box where you can give us your feedback on today's webinar. Now, Elena, would you like to tell us about today's topic and what we'll be covering?
Yes. Well, indeed, we have 3 main objectives with this webinar. First of all, don't expect us to cover very technical issues about quality of service. Neither of us is an engineer. But what we will try to do is really to have a tour around the world and to see a bit what are the main approaches towards the quality of service and the quality of experience in the electronic communication sector. We will provide a few examples. We will try, Laurence mainly from Europe and myself from the rest of the world. And we will try to see whether there are any similarities, differences, and main trends that occur nowadays in this very important debate that is quite an old debate, actually. Quality of service is one of the oldest regulatory topics that exist in the telecommunication sector. And then we will see in the end about what we might expect for the future, so the next steps and what are the newest issues that might emerge in this debate.
Okay, so you say we will not going to be very technical, but nevertheless we need to explain a little bit what we're going to talk about.
So I will do it with my terminology, just to explain a bit. And we borrowed this scheme from BEREC, the body of European regulators, that was published in 2011. Essentially, we have 2 main definitions: quality of service and quality of experience. When we talk about quality of service, we can say that we talk, first of all, about network performance, so some very technical parameters that can be measured, like, for example, the quality of the voice, or, for example, the completion of a call, dropped call, and this kind of issues that can be measured and can be quantified. We have network performance, and we also have non-network performance that can also be measured, like, for example, the need to repair a line, or, for example, the time it takes to activate a line. In the very old time, it took days and days to have a line. Sometimes you had to wait months to get a line to place telephone calls. And of course, this has been measured over time. Quality of experience is quite a newer term, and it means really when you have the end users get into the picture of this debate. And it means that, for example, it started from surveys, just asking consumers what they thought about
level of satisfaction.
Exactly, level of satisfaction. Now there are also more different ways, tools and applications even to have an idea and measure somehow what is the level of experience that end users are getting.
Mm-hmm. Very good.
And so I think that in our discussion today, what we are going to do is also to analyze a bit the three main actors in this discussion, because essentially when we talk about quality of service and quality of experience, it's really about three main actors that are interacting. On one hand, you have, let's say, the providers who are providing the service, and the service in itself already tells something in terms of quality. Then you have the end users who somehow have their experience, but also have their own rights. They have contracts, and so they, let's say that quality is also a very important part in this interaction between providers and users. And then you have the regulator, who is like a bit the entity who has to balance this interaction and set rules and intervene when necessary. And so we can also have different approaches in this ecosystem. Because on one hand, you can have a command and control situation where you have, let's say, a regulator that decides what, for example, the parameters are. They set targets, they set the rules, and so on. And providers have to comply. And if they don't comply, the regulator can issue fines, and there can be these sanctions. And so it's
quite a strict approach.
It's quite a strict approach, let's say. Then there is another approach that is a bit different, because you have encouragement and transparency. This is has come into the scene more in a competitive environment when competition was introduced in the telecom sector. And in that case, sometimes it's the providers themselves who set their own targets, and they are very eager to have their, their performance published and made public to consumers, so that there is also a possibility to get more clients, and there is the possibility to switch for consumers. So it's a bit different environment. And then there is a third one that is about consumer empowerment. So it's really about new ways to enable the consumer to really have better quality, and means also to, for example, have an easy possibility to complain, and other aspects, or even apps to measure the performance, for example.
So we're looking more at quality of experience when we talk about consumer empowerment. It's a bit of a new trend. We will see
exactly.
examples.
And so I think the first question I have to you is really about to start from Europe, because how does it work in Europe, and how do you see this evolution?
Yes, indeed. So in Europe, we'll see that the approach has been more based on transparency. Before going into national examples, I'd like to take a look at the European framework, and to go back a little bit in history, because I say it's about transparency, but it was not always the case. We had, if we go all the way back to 1998, early days of liberalization, of course, at the time, we're really focusing on traditional telephony services. And the European texts say that NRAs may impose on certain providers, namely the one with significant market power or universal service providers, some targets, and possibly impose some fine if the targets are not met. Of course, the idea was to ensure, while opening to competition, that a user will still have access to telephony services of a certain quality.
So the big change was with the introduction of competition,
absolutely,
really.
Absolutely. And moving on to 2002 with the Universal Service Directive, here the focus is still on universal service providers, where NRAs may set targets on them, but there is suddenly also more transparency obligation imposed that NRAs may impose on all providers. So the scope is expanding a little bit. And in 2009, now we're moving to also addressing providers of internet access. And the Citizen Rights Directive focused mainly on fixed services. For example, says that providers give information on any traffic management practices that may have an impact on quality of service. And moving on to 2015, we'll still focus on internet access services more on the mobile side. It's the TSM, the Telecom Single Market, setting net neutrality rules at EU level. And now we have the European Electronic Communications Code adopted in December last year. So the scope is yet again extending, and we'll see that now it even targets possibly OTTs, over-the-top players. And I'd like to dive in a little bit more into the code.
No, but I just wanted to comment. So this evolution is really also about the change of services. So it really was a way to adapt regulation and thus quality of service regulation to an ever-changing environment, not only in terms of competition, but also in terms of type of services. Because with mobile, I assume that there was a big boost in terms of a need to check quality, but also with broadband, for example.
Absolutely. So an evolution in the digital world, indeed.
Yes.
And the code actually has a lot of focus, a whole chapter dedicated to end users' rights. And a big part of it focuses on more detailed and structured rules around quality of service. And by the way, the code was adopted, I say, in December last year. Member states in Europe have 2 years to implement it, so up to 21st of December 2020, next year. And here are the provisions in the code focusing on quality of service. We have some transparency rules in contracts, meaning that providers should include information on the minimum quality of service levels in their contracts with the end users. There's also some transparency and a bit of empowerment with the fact that NRAs have to ensure that users have access to at least one independent comparison tool that will compare providers based on tariff, prices, but also quality of service. And finally, we have Article 104 linked with Annex 10, which says that NRA may require providers to publish comprehensive, comparable, up-to-date information on quality of service. And going even further, the code says that NRA may specify which quality of service parameters may be measured, and they are actually contained in Annex 10. I will go through them a little bit later.
So this is really, so I see that this is about also the providers who can be subject to this measurement.
Exactly.
So I see that it's really, again, about an evolution of who are now the players,
Absolutely.
not just telecommunication providers.
The code actually redefines electronic communication services, and the definition encompasses all these actors: internet access services, interpersonal communication services, being number-based, so this is telephony, traditional telephony services, but also number-independent services such as WhatsApp, which use a phone number not to connect a call, but just to identify the end user, so they're number-independent. And there is also services related to the conveyance of signals, such as machine-to-machine services or broadcasting services. I will exclude them because I talked about Article 104 and which providers may be subject to measure some parameters on quality of service. It's not the case of conveyance of signal. We're really focusing on Internet of Access services, interpersonal communication services, both number-based and number-independent. Here is the novelty. They're actually, OTTs are actually covered, may actually be covered by this obligation. The code specified to the extent that they control at least some elements of the network, either directly or via a service level agreement with a network provider. So this is the scope of the new rules. And here is what we find in Annex 10. These are the quality parameters that NRA may require measurements from the providers. Some apply to electronic communication networks, some to interpersonal communication services, and some to internet access services.
I see that they are the typical parameters, but there are two new.
Exactly. Yeah. Some of them are not new. They've been already there in the previous framework. Okay. Some of them are new, such as, I believe, voice connection quality, drop call ratio, failure probability, call signaling delays. All these are new parameters in the code. The list has been based on the parameters most widely used by NRAs in Europe. That's how the Commission built up this, the EU legislator built up this list. And they're all based on European and international standards as they are defined. And
so this is, let's say, something they can do, but
they don't have to.
Okay.
I mean, let's explain that a bit more in detail. BEREC is supposed to adopt, so the body of European regulators is supposed to adopt some guidelines on these quality of service parameters. It will be done by June next year, but we already had some draft guidelines in October this year, and we'll see a little bit more explanation from BEREC on these parameters. And BEREC clarifies that, of course, this is there is a degree of flexibility for NRAs to pick and choose some parameters. Of course, if it makes sense in the national context, they have to see if it's needed or not, what should be measured in their markets.
So in practice, at the national level, they would have to issue a decision if they want to.
NRAs, yes.
So it's decided
at national level, absolutely, with the help of the BEREC guidelines, which also specify some more parameters actually to this list. They added some parameters on, for example, on SNS mobile, on customer services, and also on services for users with disabilities. So we even have more parameters detailed by BEREC in the guidelines. So to conclude on the European approach, on the EU rules set at EU level, as I said, we have some new definition of who the providers are and who is targeted by the rules. We have a list of parameters, so a lot of transparency. NRAs may require publication of certain quality of service information and specify which quality of service parameters should be measured. And we have a little bit of empowerment as well for end users, which will have access to a comparison tool based also on quality of service. So we have a little bit of a mixed approach, but the focus is really on transparency. So I'd like to take on some national examples now that we've set the EU framework. And I'd like to start with France. In France, the regulator ARCEP has been really working on improving information on quality of service, both on mobile and on fixed network. And for mobile, they have now a dedicated platform publishing coverage maps from providers. And this has been really improved since 2017. It is based on information given by the providers. So it's theoretical, it's a simulation made by providers, but they have to give some detailed information on each location, whether the coverage is very good, only good, limited, or no coverage at all. So we have more details than we used to have. And they also have, providers also have to give information on the location of each base station and which technology they offer on each base station. So this is quite a theoretical exercise, as I say, yet there is something for users in that. It's an information, a transparency tool. So, for example, my mom lives in a rural area in the south of France, and with such a tool, if she's not happy with our current provider, with the connectivity she's getting at home, she can actually see on this platform, well, there's actually a base station from another provider, which is closer to my home and will provide me better services. So it's giving more information to users to make more informed choices at the time of choosing a provider.
Is there a tendency, let's say, by end users to monitor and to have these, to use these tools?
Well, we see more and more. This is the example of France, but we see more and more that NRAs are developing tools. So NRAs are empowered, as we say, to measure the quality of service and make their choices based on concrete information on quality.
So they're also active in communicating, for example, in
exactly. And yet there's another. Exactly, awareness. And yet there's another, I didn't have a slide on that, but ARCEP also developed a tool where a user may comment on their level of satisfaction on a certain service. So they're really empowered to give their opinion and to make informed choices.
Are there other regulators in Europe that are doing, for example, this type of awareness raising activities?
Yes, we will talk about the UK in just a moment. There's many other examples which unfortunately I will not be able to cover for time restriction. I'll just like to finish the example of France before moving on to the UK. As I say, this is a simulation, but there is another tab of these maps developed by ARCEP. Because here on the ground, ARCEP actually, the idea is that those maps are accurate to 95%. So ARCEP goes on the ground and make some checks to be sure that the information given by the providers is exact, so at the precise location that you actually have availability of the service. But on top of that, ARCEP also does some quality tests, so really about the experience on the ground. And they do that in all the key French cities, on all the French highways, the train lines, metro lines even, touristic sites, both indoor and outdoor. And they're trying to answer quality questions. So at this location, how fast can I download a video? How fast can I send an SMS, etc. And all this information is added to this platform I mentioned. So this was on mobile. On the fixed side, ARCEP also developed some new tools. It's a bit technical, but I'll try to do my best to make it clear and simplify the information. The idea is that ARCEP developed a code of conduct for all commercial websites out there used by end users to perform a speed test. So to perform a test to know the exact speed of their internet access connection. And the code of conduct actually set some rules to be sure that all those tools gather information in a comparable way and a transparent way. At the moment, we have 5 tools in France that are declared to comply with ARCEP code of conduct. And going a step further, ARCEP adopted a decision which will impose on all main providers, broadband providers in France, to place a small software, an API, on all end users' boxes at home. And what this API will do, it will be a kind of ID card of the internet connection, meaning that anytime an end user will perform a test on one of these platforms that I mentioned, one of the 5 at the moment, not only will we have a result of speed, but we will also know what kind of connection the end user has at home, using fiber, or is it on DSL, etc. How is he connected at home? Because, of course, this has an impact on the result of the test. Is it Wi-Fi or is it a cable connection? And also, what is the contractual speed of the end user? So all this gives more information around speed test results. And the idea with that is that ARCEP will be collecting in a kind of crowdsourcing way, because here we're involving third-party actors to have more and more information on the quality of service on fixed broadband in France.
But the information is sent directly to ARCEP?
Not directly to ARCEP. It is sent to those tools. They are the one gathering. Okay. But thanks to this code of conduct, the result will be organized. And indirectly, we will have more information to potentially regulate traffic. So that was the example of France. Moving on to the UK, since April this year, we have a new scheme. It's an industry scheme. So we talked about transparency, but also encouragement when the providers themselves go one step further in terms of quality of service. Of course, it's a scheme approved by Ofcom, but it comes from broadband providers, and they actually represent more than 95% of all the broadband providers in the UK. And they commit to, in case they fail in some specific quality of service targets, they commit to automatically compensate end users. So in case, for example, of a delayed repair following a loss of service, a missed appointment with a technician, or delays with the start of a new service, in all these cases, the end user will be automatically compensated without having to reach out to his providers and claim for compensation. So that's quite a step further in empowering consumers. Another industry scheme as well is on broadband speeds, where here providers have committed to give more information to the end user at the point of sale on the quality of service they will get in terms of broadband speed, and also ensure that the end user will be able to leave the contract at no fee if they actually don't get the minimum speed they were promised. So again, a step further. And what we have also in the UK is a report done every year by Ofcom. It's based on surveys of consumers, measuring their level of satisfaction on different parameters. It's also done based on some information by the providers, and every year it basically makes a ranking of providers. So it's also a tool for consumers to pick and choose a provider depending on what are their needs on different quality of service parameters.
So thinking of our famous triangle of relationship between regulator, user, and industry, how do you see overall the UK and more generally Europe?
More general, as I said, I only have been able to talk about 2 countries.
Yes.
There are, of course, much more situations out there. There are still some countries, for example, imposing some targets on all providers, but that's still rare. We're really moving to more transparency and more tools appearing in member states to empower end users, and quite some interesting ones, as I mentioned. So that was my tour for Europe, and I'd like to move on to the rest of the world with you, Elena.
Okay, so of course it would be overambitious to cover all the rest of the world in 20 minutes, but I will try. And let's say to provide some examples that, in my opinion, are quite interesting and show a bit what are the trends in different geographies. And so I would start from Brazil. It's not a coincidence. I've been following Brazil for many, many years. I know the Brazilian framework quite well. But I can also see that what we see in Brazil is not too different from most of Latin America, for example, but is also observed in many other countries around the world. For example, in Asia and Africa, you also see many countries where you still have a similar framework, where that really is mostly based on a mix of approaches. So on one hand, you have quite a comprehensive command and control framework. And then you have also other, let's say, ways of incentivizing, somehow promoting quality of service and quality of experience. Okay, so it's so let's say that looking at the evolution, that is very quickly, just to say that it really started very early with regulating quality of service. They even have a very specific regulation about quality of service, and they are, let's say, a regulation, and let's say that for example, the quality of service for mobile dates 2011. We have, let's say, former regulation, but that is an update of former regulations, and that is also in the case of fixed telephony, for example. There were even plans with the targets, and so in a very traditional approach at the very beginning. Now the current framework is dated 2012. But for example, the regulation on pay TV in Brazil is now the currently used is dates 2005. But that, having said that, let's say the situation has evolved a bit. For example, in 2011, they introduced also new rules about guaranteed broadband speed. Also, they have an entity that is carrying out measurements on the ground, and it's outside Anatel, but of course it's supervised by Anatel, where really the regulator and the industry are working together in order to deliver certain type of activities. And then there are very interesting rules today that are about converting this very strict command and control environment into a bit more flexible one. So the possibility, for example, to convert sanctions into actions and even investment in underserved areas, for example. There are, let's say, interesting examples. Of course, the implementation can be somehow complex of these rules, but we see an overall effort to, on one hand, simplify the framework, somehow also implement some rules that can have like a responsive regulation, let's say the possibility for industry to propose some solutions, a bit in the UK approach. I think this sense of responsive regulation is something that is very close to the approach that we see, for example, in the UK and in other northern European countries.
And so In Brazil, do we still have some monitoring on the compliance on all those targets?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Just to show you a bit the situation, here are the 4 main categories of services. You have fixed broadband, a mobile service, fixed telephony, and pay TV. Each has its own regulation, as I said. And in each regulation, you have some indicators that are let's say, where you have some targets that are set on providers. Let's say all providers should comply except small providers, and they also recently redefined the concept of small provider in Brazil, and now it's all the providers who have less than 5% of market shares in the relevant market. Also, let's say these indicators, so they have their targets, but there are also other indicators that are measured but without targets, and they are called the research indicators. So there are plenty of them, because you have to consider that, for example, in the case of mobile service, in the regulation you look at it and there are 14 indicators with targets. But then the measurement and also the reporting obligations, because operators have to report on their own measurements every month, they are at the geographic scope that is set in the regulation. So, for example, sometimes it's at the municipality level, and there are over 5,000 municipalities in Brazil. Sometimes it's in the numbering area. So it really depends on the type of indicator and the type of service. So it comes up, for example, I was looking at the statistics. It's very complicated to even look at the statistics because only for mobile in 2017 you had more than 60,000 indicators, and some were, let's say, compliant, some non-compliant, and in case of non-compliance, let's say there are some enforcement activities and so on. So it's really a complex, extremely, let's say, comprehensive and complex environment for also for compliance control and enforcement.
So it's for me, it's a pure command and control approach, really, with all these targets. Would you say that, or is there a nuance?
It's still a command and control. As I said, by the way, there are also other measures that are added in the picture, because it's let's say Anatel and industry have a dialogue on that, and they are somehow trying also to make this complex environment a bit more manageable, and also to make sure that instead of just paying fines, which also implies, let's say, some administrative activity and so on, there is also, let's say, the possibility to convert this fine into investment. So really to have the possibility to directly address gaps where they exist, and especially in areas where, for example, you have some needs regarding the network, but also, for example, some socioeconomic clusters that might need some specific attention and better quality and so on. So I think it's
that's very interesting.
Yeah, but overall you see that the indicators are in any case overall not so bad, because
with the hour here and the percentage.
Yes, you see that in the end there is quite a good level of compliance overall. It is clear that when they come to this final summary, it is really about measuring let's say the compliant parameters versus the total parameters. So it's that is really the indicator that is then advertised. But for example, Anatel advertises, you know, the performance and the rankings, and so it gives good publicity to this, let's say, quality provision.
It's an incentive also.
Yes, and you see that there is also this empowerment effort, and Anatel has been one of the very first regulators in the world to introduce very advanced schemes, and I think it's in that respect. Sorry, but I follow LATAM for so many years, and also in Peru, but in other countries, in Mexico, they have amazing tools to really empower end users to make sure that even, you know, we're talking about very large countries with huge population. And in these countries, you can really have the level of details. Here, for example, you see all the the mobile operators, and you see their antennas, and they indicate also the technology, if it is, for example, 3G, 4G, and also they provide in the same app, let's say, the main parameters for, in this case, a mobile service. You can see really what was the performance of each of those providers in that area for the past 12 months, which I think it's quite an empowering tool, because of course consumers can switch, can decide, can make informed decisions, and that is since 2012. You mentioned it's quite a few years now that it's running. Yes, yes, it was introduced in 2012, and then of course that was the first release, but it has been improving over time quite a lot. And let's say that another effort in Brazil to empower consumers is really about encouraging and somehow pushing to the solution of consumer claims. That, I think, is a very important part of the equation, because we cannot talk about empowerment if there is no possibility for consumers to see an issue.
To get compensation also.
Yes. Let's say that but compensation is a bit different, because I think in that case, for example, in the UK, they found a different solution. Here, about claims, you still have consumer claims as part of the mandatory targets that are for each of the main services. But still, Anatel is making an effort to make sure that consumers can somehow have a possibility to, you know, represent an issue, but it's also an incentive for operators to, you know, to solve, and somehow it creates, you know, it is a way to somehow facilitate this dialogue that sometimes, especially in large countries where you have many consumers, it can be complicated. And I think that in other countries in Latin America, you also have the regulator who is quite active in this sense. You see, for example, in Peru, they have the TRASU, that is really, you know, even a kind of tribunal that they have within the regulator in order to solve a situation that couldn't be solved before between end user and the provider. But you also see an interesting thing about, you know, moving in some countries towards mediation, to introduce, let's say, some mechanism to facilitate the solution of these disputes. For example, in Mexico, you have that. In Brazil, you have the PROCON, that somehow is an entity that is solving issues not just in the telecommunication sector, but also in telecoms. And I think that in Colombia, they're also now considering, for example, some mechanism to have this mediation and facilitation mechanism.
So could you conclude maybe for Brazil and potentially other countries in Latin America that the approach is quite mixed, however, quality of service and quality of experience is still high on the agenda of the regulators?
Yes, quality is absolutely important, also because you have to consider the level of development, and also the speed of development, and the fierce competition that exists in certain environments. For example, you have to think that we cannot compare the level of development of fixed telephony of Europe and in other markets where they might have some infrastructure gaps at the beginning, and for example, the mobile that really became the main way of communicating compared with fixed. So there are all these issues that really refer to the national and regional situation that must be taken into account when we talk about quality of service. Of course, we can say that quality of service is still very high in the agenda of regulators in Latin America, also because sometimes problems are important and need to be solved. But I think that the dialogue with industry is moving forward, and there is a response and a way, awareness also, the possibility today to simplify certain framework and with new technologies and new approaches, for example.
Indeed. So that was for Brazil. Would you like to move on to another region?
Yes, a big jump. From a huge country like Brazil, we go to a very small country like Singapore that has completely different challenges in terms of infrastructure gaps, obviously. But still, also in the case of Singapore, I think it's a nice example because they have a quality of service very high in the regulator agenda. And it was, I was recently in Singapore because I went to a quality of service conference hosted by the regulator IMDA and organized by the ITU. So I was really surprised. I mean, for me, it was a revelation. So I took the freedom to somehow repropose what I learned, what I saw in Singapore for this audience today, because I think it's an amazing example. So in the case of Singapore, first of all, the approach is very pragmatic. You see the revolution here can really be well represented with the evolution of the relevance of the different services. Because, for example, at some point, a certain type of services like paging, trunked radio were dropped in 2005 because 2G was in the scene, and also, for example, broadband access service was introduced in 2007 when it became something more relevant. 2G was dropped, but was dropped only in 2012. So at some point you saw coexisting with 3G and 2G, and now you have coexisting 3G and 4G, and who knows, maybe in the future we will see what happens about 5G, because let's say that it's an evolution that really reflects the level of adoption of certain services and the relevance. So
and I was going to ask you, here we are, if there are as many targets and compliance control like we just saw in Brazil.
Well, no, in the sense that it's still, there are targets. Also in this case, there are both, let's say, mandatory targets, and there are also some research indicators that are just, for monitoring and for awareness, but not really in terms of a possibility to sanction or to intervene. But in general, yes, if you say it's a command and control, in certain respects it is. But at the same time, the number of, for example, of targets is much lower compared with Brazil. And also the number of providers who are subject to these rules are fewer. But it's very interesting. I will go very quickly through them just to see what is the approach in Singapore. For example, as regards mobile, we have, because I talked about Brazil, these 14 indicators and lots of things being monitored and so on. In Singapore, you have, let's say, nowadays 3 providers for 3G and 4 for 4G, because there is a new entrant who directly entered with 4G service. And let's say that they have only 3 targets, and these targets are coverage related. And it's interesting because when we talk about coverage here, it's not just the typical outdoor coverage, where they have very ambitious targets. It's like 99%, if I'm not wrong.
Okay.
And it's also indoor. In the case of indoor, for example, providers must ensure 85% indoor coverage. And they also have obligations regarding coverage in tunnels. Okay. So, that is quite, let's say, unique in the sense that there are not so many countries that are monitoring indoor or setting this type of targets. And it's interesting because the way they, let's say, they enforce and they monitor, let's say, and they do compliance is a bit different because, let's say, okay, there is a reporting from providers.
To the regulator?
To the regulator, yes. And the regulator, let's say, does also its own tests that can be not just the drive tests, but also walk tests, because they have to walk in the buildings, in the tunnels, and so on. So it's really, they do also their independent measurements. And let's say that there is the possibility to fine operators generally, and if you look at the statistics, you see that generally the providers overperform. So it's very rare that you see some issues. But if an issue emerges, for example, regarding indoor coverage, what happens is that there is still, let's say, the regulator gives a bit of time to the providers to adjust a situation and really to remedy without the need really to impose the fine. The fines are also, depending on the type of service, they are in the order of magnitude of between $5,000, $50,000, depending on the gravity, depending on the service, the frequency, and so on. But it's something that is less present. Let's say that the sanctioning part is more of an issue in Latin America. Here, it's really more like, okay, a possibility, but it's quite a remote possibility that it's more about encouraging. And also, you know, the type of services here, you see that, okay, they still have basic telecommunication, essentially divided between residential and businesses, but the targets, if I remember well, are the same. And let's say it's only 2 parameters about installation and fault repair. It's not about all those technical network issues, because probably there is no longer the need to measure those. Broadband access is also about some very few and very key indicators. And then they also have some indicators about fiber connectivity. And in Singapore, they have a very specific framework for that, because they have only one provider who is directly providing fiber to the home. Is called Netlink Trust. And it's like open to third parties. So it's really about installation time, but it's not just about installation to end users, but also to you know, other providers. So in a non-competitive environment, non-discriminatory, all these kind of issues that are addressed here.
A wholesale part.
Okay. But so answering to your question, of course, there is a mix of command and control, as I said. Let's say a bit different from Brazil, but still there is this dimension of having targets. But there are also other things in Singapore, and I was really impressed when I saw this in Singapore, so I wanted to just share my my interest in this approach, because let's say that they have, the regulator has created this crowdsource quality of service, quality of experience, in this case, data collection system. It's a voluntary scheme. So it's, I don't know.
It's an application that the end user can download.
There is an API, but it's not mandatory. So it's really here the end users who can download. Yes, but at some point when it's downloaded, it's really a tool that can be used by them not only to measure speed, to see the connectivity, the performance regarding connection to popular websites, but also the possibility to send feedback. And I think...
so that is crowdsourcing ID for the regulator?
Yes, yes, exactly. So in this case, it's, let's say that the feedback is sent directly to the regulator. And let's say here it explains a bit how it works. It's really about downloading the application, and then let's say that the application remains in the background and continues to send some information that is somehow then anonymized and sent to the regulator, who will use this anonymized data in order to understand whether there is an issue, to do some analytics and understand really how the network is working.
And then maybe to engage with providers to solve specific problems.
We're talking about very well-performing networks. Really, it's really not an intrusive, in my opinion. It's not really something where it's more like really understanding from the also the network point of view, and understanding what end users are getting, and to ensure that the end users have top quality services that are present in Singapore. And just to compare, because we're talking about Asia. It's difficult because in Latin America you see somehow a trend, and there are a lot of similarities. In Asia, it's more difficult to understand these similarities. There are very different environments, and I just, was curious, and I went to look at, for example, what they are doing in Hong Kong. That is somehow a bit comparable with Singapore in terms of size, at least, and also they are very advanced in terms of network environment and so on. Also, in that case, it's very competitive. Let's say that in Hong Kong they have a slightly different approach, because it's more similar to Europe somehow. It's more really about encouragement. It's about transparency, and you see that for example, there are no targets set by the regulators, or it's the operators themselves who set their own targets. They do these pledges, and they are included in service charters, and they commit with end users. Of course, the regulator, the Office of the Communication Authority, has, let's say, a role of raising awareness, encouraging transparency, and so on. But you see that, so they publish this information, they publish comparable information, and they also, let's say, provide some tools. But these tools are not really like guaranteeing anything. These tools are more about making sure that the end users can find the relevant information. They can know, for example, about how to claim if there is an issue. There is, for example, a mediation system that is somehow approved by the OFCA, but at the same time, it's not really about sanctioning or introducing really mandatory targets or anything like that.
Okay.
Yeah. So to conclude.
So what we could conclude, I understand that we've been talking about three main regulatory approaches, but we've been talking also of countries mixing all of them together, meaning that I guess there's no magic formula to monitor quality of service, but the idea is probably to find a right balance, right?
Yes, it's really, I like this idea of the scale, because at the end of the day, it's really about every regulatory environment it needs to have a good balance, a balanced approach, depending on the market environment, depending on the level of competition, depending on the issues that end users can raise, and it's important that also the issues are reasonable and that there are reasonable expectations and so on. So in that respect, it's very important. The role of the regulator is very important, and I hope that our discussion was also useful to give an idea that sometimes you have very complex framework, because also the challenges are very important, and there is a level of complexity that requires some level of intervention. At the same time, let's say that it's very important to have a responsive environment, and that is even being attempted in Brazil right now, in the sense that the possibility to, to engage from industry, to propose solutions, and to commit, because also it's in the interest of the industry itself, to have happy customers and an advancing environment. So it's sometimes it's the simplification that can help a little bit.
And as you mentioned, you attended some ITU workshops. Do you have something maybe to tell about new trends in terms of new developments on quality of service?
Indeed, it's quite interesting, and for me it was a total surprise, and because recently I was also invited to these conferences, and so I could also hear from experts from the ITU and also from regulators around the world. And there is this study group 12 at the ITU. They are doing an amazing job in terms of really analyzing not only the quality of service and quality of experience topic in a very comprehensive way, also addressing the technical issue that we couldn't address today for sure, but also to look at the new services, look, for example, how the framework might evolve, to look, for example, at the new technologies, to look, for example, at the new services, like, for example, quality of service for gaming, quality of service for video. These are new topics, and they are somehow being discussed, being analyzed, because with the technology advancement also and new services, of course, there are new issues that emerge, new questions mark, and so it's an exciting topic, really. So do we have questions?
Yeah, I was taking the tablet, sorry, Elena, to see if we had a few question and answer. We only have a few minutes, so I'm going to have to be selective, and we'll all come back to you for all the questions. We don't have time to answer. I just see one right now, which I may be able to answer on the comparison tool that is indicated in the new code. And whether there are already some example in some member states. So yes, so the code, of course, says that end users should have access to a comparison tool, I said, based on offers and tariffs, but also on quality of service parameters. And the code lists certain criteria that has to be complied by this comparison tool to be certified by the national regulators. So they have to be independent, they have to use plain language, explain clearly on which criteria they base the comparison, etc. There's a whole list. And it's true that we already have some examples. In some countries, I believe in the UK and also in Belgium, for example, it's the NRA themselves who developed this comparison tool on their own website. And in some other countries, I'm thinking of the Czech Republic, we have, of course, some information and some benchmark on that, which we could share. In the Czech Republic, it's a third party providing this comparison tool, but it is certified by the NRA. So we already have a few examples. And yet again, transposition of this provision of the code has to happen by December next year.
Yeah. No, I would like to add to that. I don't know if of interest because they asked about Europe, but if I may add some other examples, I think it's first of all, there is a huge complexity to compare retail offers in an ever...
And keeping up to date as well.
Exactly, because there are promotions, there are a number of issues that make this comparison extremely complex, but still there are some regulators. For example, in Mexico, they have a comparison tool that is quite interesting for mobile, and let's say other regulators, for example, in Brazil, it's a work in progress. They are really trying to put it together, and because it's something that is becoming increasingly important, and but we have to recognize the complexity
of such a work.
To have this, yes, because it's a huge work.
Indeed. We only have a few seconds left, so I'm sorry for the unanswered question. We will come back to you by email, and we will have to wrap up here and conclude. The recording of this webinar will be available soon, so you may rewatch it and you may continue to ask us questions. And also don't forget that you have a survey box where you can give us your feedback on the webinar. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.